Let's step back a bit in history. The year is 2006. I'm 12 years old. It is my birthday, and I have wandered myself, along with my mom, of course, into the video game section at Walmart looking for a new title that I can beg her to purchase as a birthday gift for me. And as I am perusing the aisles, there's one game that really stands out amongst them, and it's a cover just scattered with bullets and just one word just visually standing there, striking quite the presentation for me, and that was the game Black. And yes, I begged my mom for this game, and I bought it, and it was a game that was a big part of my childhood. And so I recently had decided, hey, I'm going to pick this copy up. I'm going to give it a playthrough and see exactly how I'm feeling about it many years later. So welcome, friend. It's great to see you. And today we're going to talk about the game Black. So very excited to have this title and to have recently played it through. I think before we talk too much about the history of the game or my experience playing the game through, let's just take a look at the cover. And I think this cover is one of the most striking pieces of physical art in my collection. I just love how simple and how intricate it is quite at the same time. And that carries on to the spine as well. So it always looks really nice on a shelf. And on the back we see all guns blazing. As a black operative, you'll obey no laws, know no borders, kill without mercy, and live by the 5 rules of gun craft. And there we can see it. Pretty cool, just some screenshots from the gameplay, etc. And what are the 5 rules? Well, the first rule, guns are the stars. And this is really a thesis of this game's design mantra. 2, every bullet is your baby. Okay. 3, bigger guns, louder explosions. 4, leave a trail of destruction. And 5, get creative with your kills. Pretty cool. And I think especially on the Xbox, this game continues its striking design with kind of the bright green. We see some very simple design art on the CD, and then the manual carries the front cover's design as well. And this manual is pretty thin, not too much happening in here. It's in black and white, so not super fancy. It just tells a little bit about how to play the game and what the UI is like. I love the saving and loading part because it's for profiles, not really for any in-progress part of the game. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the game has a limited 90-day warranty. Interesting. Very interesting content in this manual. All right. Anyways, let's get the game up on the shelf and then let's give it a little talking through. There we go. So Black was developed by Criterion Games, and Criterion Games is really well known for the Burnout series, the more recent Need for Speed games, and kind of more randomly, I think, Battlefield in more recent years. I guess that's what EA thinks is best for Criterion to be working on. Okay. And the game's published by EA. So when Black was first a game up for design and development, you know, Criterion really wanted to reinvent the shooter genre quite in the way they had been doing in recent years with the Burnout series. And so they thought they could really achieve this through a lot of the design mantra we'll see in this game. Not only what I read on the back there, but through destructible environments, making firearms feel much closer to their real-life counterparts in terms of the interaction with the environment. So how bullets hit buildings and cause damage to environments and terrain, etc. And with, of course, the exaggerated swagger of a gun lover's dream of peak weapon design. This game loves guns, and it wants to show you that from the moment you see the album art or the cover art. And it somehow captures that through its presentation in a way that really no game has since, I would say, and that was its essence. You know, the design philosophy of Black as a title is very straightforward, and you can seriously tell from the moment you load the game and see the guns being reloaded and firing off in the background exactly what you're in for. So that's a little bit about the history and development of the game. And so what I really want to talk first on is the story. I think it's an important aspect of any game, and Black's story here is interesting. So I have played this game through maybe 6 or 7 times in my life, and the story is straightforward, but also incredibly dull. So I've always kind of overlooked it to some extent or another. And so through this playthrough, I was very much focused on understanding a little bit more about like, hey, what's exactly going on here? So the game is set in Russia, and you're playing as Jack Keller, and Keller is a bit of a rogue agent, part of a CIA Black Ops unit, and he's imprisoned in some sort of way. The game doesn't really say, but that's where he is at the start of the game. And a man named Paul demands Keller to give him the spiel on a terrorist organization's actions. It's called the Seventh Wave, and Keller agrees to do so. So over the course of his retelling, Keller meets a former CIA operative who is working with Seventh Wave by the name of Lennox, and he's kind of on a mission to track down and capture or kill Lennox. And so the following missions will have you kind of working towards that, I guess. You'll destroy some weapon caches, you'll go after a different boss of Seventh Wave, you'll battle across a bridge to chase Lennox. But I'd say overall the threads here are pretty loose, even as I was following the story. And the game really seems to pick up once it ends, I'll be honest. So if you played through the game, there's a huge cliffhanger at the end, hitting at the time the story really begins to develop, and it seems like those will never be kind of resolved here now almost 20 years later, and we still haven't seen a sequel to Black. So the story, I would say, is just kind of middling. There's not much here, and I think that from my understanding of the development of the game, the developers were truly focused on just creating an exciting gameplay experience. And so yes, story was kind of like at the back burner, but I feel like they still could have done a little bit more, even if tying mission objectives strictly to going after this guy Lennox. I would have loved to have seen a little more in the story department. But story doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to hold back the gameplay, and that was the focus of this game. And so let's talk a little bit about the gameplay itself. So the game is very straightforwardly an FPS title. So you can carry 2 weapons, which actually requires a bit of strategy in terms of understanding exactly what you're going to want to use. And that's because you'll get rare weapons, but they'll also have very limited ammo. And so that could kind of screw you mid-level if you're not prepared for kind of upcoming action sequences. Or you could also take something reliable. Like everybody in the game carries an AK-47. You can pick one of those up. You'll always find ammo for it. It'll always be available for you as a backup. And so, for me, that's how I approach the game, more or less, using an AK or a carbine. And then I would carry with me as a backup whatever cool special weapon I could find in the environment. Is that the RPG? Is it a grenade launcher? Is it a sniper rifle? Or maybe an Uzi or a shotgun? And so that was kind of the play on the game. And I did like the 2-weapon system. I feel like it does introduce a little bit of thought into your approach, as opposed to just having all the weapons available, and whichever one has ammo you just kind of use. And that can work. It works great in a game like Doom Eternal, for example, where there is a limited amount of resources in terms of bullets you can get for the weapons, and you have to constantly switch them. But that wasn't so much of a consideration here in Black. I did like strategically thinking like, oh, okay, if I have this RPG and it just has 2 rounds, is that really going to be more important than me having a shotgun going into this next section where I'm like underground, So I did appreciate that. I'd also say the game is very linear. You're just kind of moving from point A to B in many of the levels and completing the objectives. There are some collectibles along the way. You'll find intelligence documents, blueprints kind of sprinkled around the game world, but they don't really do too much for you in terms of unlocks or special items and things. You can mostly only get those through completion of the game on various difficulties. So I thought that for the most part these were kind of negligible unless you wanted to go to your mission select screen and see, oh, I got all of the collectibles in this level. That's kind of neat. The game incorporates some interesting technology as well that we hadn't seen in games quite in the same way. So a good example that is going to stick out right away when you play the game is there's a real-time blur and depth of field kind of going on in many of the scenes. So if you're poked up against a wall or you're reloading a weapon, your field of view is going to change, and your character is going to focus more on reloading the weapon, for instance, than they are on kind of what's going on out there in the environment. It would have been cool to see some evolution of that throughout the course of the game, such as maybe earlier on you're picking up these weapons the character's not so familiar with, they're reloading it, they're paying more attention to it, so the depth of field is blurred. However, maybe later in the game, your character would be able to focus more out on the action as opposed to their gun. If you're in the middle of a firestorm fight with like 15 guys, and you're trying to take them all out, the last thing you're doing as you're reloading your gun is probably paying attention to the gun itself. In that moment, you're likely trying to pay attention to what's going on out beyond just that. But I did really like the technology and the ideas that they were bringing to this game. It was incredibly innovative and interesting and different stylistically, and so I could really appreciate that. And we also get some things we'll see in modern titles to follow as well, such as, your health gets really low. You're going to start to see a saturation drain out of the screen. You're going to start to hear audible heartbeat sounds, and the game is going to kind of move a little slower. And so I did kind of like these little interesting parts because it made those moments in the game from a presentation lens just feel different again. And we also get a lot of cool effects throughout the course of the game, not only tailored to this, but explosions, those bullets kind of flying off buildings, causing damage, which is something that in 2006 hadn't been explored so much. And so I found it impressive just how much Criterion was just kind of doing their own thing and picking up the threads of what FPS had done up to that point and just saying, we're going to do something different. We're going to make something interesting and just unique. And I think that they really achieve there. I also want to talk a little bit about the control scheme and structure for the game. One of the things I thought was interesting and I had to readjust to was that the game has a very low sensitivity built into it, and you can't actually change that. So when you're turning, it's going to take some time. There's also a wide dead zone range, so you kind of get this very stiff responsiveness to your movements because the acceleration of turning is not super high, and this is both horizontally and vertically. And so, we're very spoiled nowadays with fancy high-tech controllers and mice that can provide pinpoint accuracy for gamers. But this did kind of take a little bit of time to readjust to, and even by the end of the game was something that I felt like I wished was not as present. That there was a little more fluidity to the movement. I think you would have achieved a more realistic feel to the shooting even further than what they've tried to accomplish in the game. But just a little nitpick, it didn't hold back the gaming experience, but something that really stood out to me right away when I started playing through this title. And I'll say that unless you are kind of planning to sit down and go through a whole level, a big pain point that I had was that the game's age reflects its style of save and checkpointing. So the game's not super challenging, but if you do mess up or you have to turn the game off and return later, you're going to lose significant progress. You're going to have to restart the whole level. And especially in a level such as the bridge level, I can't remember the name of it exactly, towards the end of the game, the bridge itself can take 15 to 20 minutes to traverse. And it ends with a huge shootout where at this point you're probably limited on resources, limited on health, etc. And if you die there, you got to go back and do those 15 to 20 minutes and cross the entire bridge. So there is a little bit of trial and error here, because with that perceived knowledge of like, oh, I got to play very conservatively up to this point at the end of the bridge where we're going to have this shootout. Otherwise, I'm not going to survive. You got to think about those things. But the only way you really can is if you've failed to do it before. And one night I had to leave when I was playing the game, and kind of mid-level I had to leave and go do some errands and things, and unfortunately I had to lose all that progress along the way. There's no way to save any of your progress in the mission. So again, it's kind of old school. Not all old games were like this though, so there was some amount of design philosophy kind of built into that idea, and I just kind of wish it wasn't the case. It makes it harder to come back to this game and just pick it up and start replaying it without feeling a tad bit annoyed. So just something really to think about. Also found it odd from a control lens. Many of the weapons you can zoom in by clicking on the right stick, and there are not more iron sights or more other intricate details built into the guns of the game. I would think that for a title where guns are the prime focus, that this would be done, and it could be done. We know it could be done because the sniper scope works in that way, and the RPG, and I believe the grenade launcher as well. They have more intricate zooming in systems where you're actually using the sight on that weapon to fire. So I'm kind of surprised that they didn't do more of that. It is fine though, because it introduces the perfect cheese method that you can use for completing this entire game with ease, which is if you crouch behind an object or peek over a wall and you zoom in with the AK, you could essentially just switch the rate of fire down to single shot and pick off headshots and be invincible from your cover for the entire course of the game. And a big part of that is because the AI, they're not really smart enough to flank you, throw grenades, to flush you out of a position. So you can basically skate through the entire game as long as you're patient enough with this method. So I found that to be intriguing. There's a lot of things going on here in the gameplay that I wanted to comment on and I was observing throughout. And another one of those is that there are some funky controls here even further. I mean, you got the left trigger to throw grenades. You have switching of weapons with the D buttons, including healing with the D buttons as well. So I oftentimes found myself, oh, I'm going to press the button to switch my weapon. No, I accidentally healed myself. Okay, well that's great. Now I don't have a health pack that I kind of need, because if I die, I'm going to have to restart the whole level. And it took me a long time to reorient to this control scheme, since FPS nowadays are pretty standardized on kind of the layout and buttons you're going to use. So just another thing that's not really I'm mostly nitpicking here. It's not a negative on the game, but just something that for your awareness as somebody who might play this game, oh shoot, I should really think about that. But there are a number of things I have to give this game props for. One of those is just on its animations, which are done with a true love and care for the stylized action on display in Black. Especially in the menus, we see this. But also in the finer details, such as the jingling of the clip for the Uzi, you'll see as you're kind of running around. And I think these details are a true testament that the creators were really focused on getting these pieces right and creating an immersive experience. And I think for all of the control setbacks and gameplay flaws, that they really do accomplish that through the visual presentation of the game. And so I really like that. I would think looking back, I would have appreciated a more well-rounded approach to the game's design that did a bit more beyond sculpting the excellent, beautiful gun models and animations and gunplay. Yet, in all that, Black still presents an excellent, stylized, action-based FPS experience, just with all the fat trimmings kind of set to the side and giving you the most straightforward experience that they could get away with. I would have loved that extra little fat rendered on the game. You're eating a good steak, man. You want just a little bit of that fat trimming on there, because otherwise you're really missing out on that bold flavor, that piece that kind of elevates the experience. And this game could have used a little bit more of that. And I could see that kid self would have overlooked those things, but now having played so many games, so many FPS, are things I can say, hey, I would have appreciated that just a little more. So overall, very fun gameplay experience. Could have used a little extra seasoning on it, but otherwise, I still had a lot of fun revisiting this title so many years later. One of the things that's important for a game is not only the gameplay or its story, but the sound. The sound is so important. The sound design, the sound effects, the music. And I have to say that the sound design in Black is excellent. The game took inspiration for its sound design from many action films like Die Hard, the 24 TV series True Lies with Schwarzenegger, and it hits every time. The game and all of its guns sound so cool and punchy, and the developers brought some interesting design concepts to the game as well. One of the very cool ones is you're going to be in firefights where you have 20 NPCs gunning at you, and they'll have these AK-47s. And the developers had come up with this idea where, well, if we did that, and you can see this in Stalker, it happens in Shadow of Chernobyl quite a bit when you're fighting groups of enemies, there just becomes this drone of gun sound, right, where it just drowns out the action. And the developers wanted to create what they went on to call this idea called choir of guns, right? So under this development philosophy, each NPC would kind of have their own voice. Some of the guns would be lower in range, mid in range, or high in range. And so when they're firing all together, they're creating this harmony of sound. This harmony of sound that kind of doesn't drown anything out, creates like this beautiful droning hum. And when the action really picks up and you're hearing something like that, I think it really comes through. It's an impressive concept philosophy. It's cool that Criterion came up with that. And I think it works well in this game because throughout the firefights, I don't remember hearing this in the way that when I read about this concept, oh, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, great example of where I heard that in the game, when a number of enemies start firing off the same weapon at the same time, or so on and so forth. So that was very cool. The sound effects are very good in this game. They're punchy, they're interesting. The technology behind him is impressive. And I'll say for that soundtrack as well. So the composer who did the soundtrack, his name is Chris Tilton. And I know Chris's work from Mercenaries, Playground of Destruction. So both of these games have kind of like a sweeping orchestral sound. I'll say that the sounds are great. They work really well in Mercenaries, where the presentation is a little more kind of hopeful, bombastic in a lot of ways. In Black, I don't think they work nearly as well, just because the tone of the game is very different stylistically. We get a very good opening segment where the music plays quite well, but I think some of the little details throughout the course of the game's playthrough, you don't really pick up that soundtrack nearly as strong. And so I would say that it really depends. The high-paced action here was accompanying and delivering the right tone, in my opinion, but I don't think the style fit as well as it probably could have. I do like Chris Tilton's work, especially I love Mercenaries. I can hear the songs from Mercenaries in my head, and especially the title theme just play right out, and that's how I know it's a perfect fit. Because for me, the music in Black is not nearly as memorable as the visual design or the gameplay or so on and so forth. So from a sound lens, the game is kind of in a good spot. I think what it needed to accomplish, especially in that immersion factor, it really does. And so the final thing that I think is still important visually, the presentation especially. These are important factors in a game. The presentation here is really strong for its gunplay, its style, its cover art, the menus, very strong. And when you look past the weapons, the levels themselves and the environments, I felt the design was a little uninspired and definitely locked into place with its contemporaries of the time. So by 2005, FPS games such as Fear, Half-Life 2, Battlefield 2, these had been released. And so comparatively, Black was a bit more forgettable in comparison. The game does suffer from the 2000s era kind of color palette, design philosophy of everything needs to be gray and brown and muted green, and that's our color palette available. And it looks great, and it still looks very nice playing it on an Xbox One, backwards compatibility. However, from just like a visual presentation, the game could have had a little more color, could have done something a little more interesting there, and every level kind of feels that way. So it is something that just kind of stands out to me. But that doesn't hold the game back. It is just something that could have elevated it once again. So all said, I gotta say to my younger self, I can certainly understand where my nostalgia and appreciation for this game and the memories it gave me come from. And when I think about it more objectively, Black is a fantastic game that proves a concept, right? We love guns, guns are awesome, and this is a game that's going to celebrate that idea. From the way the guns look, to the way they sound, to the way that your character holds them in your hand, Black is a game meant to really enthusiastically elevate those ideas, and the game does so very successfully. And so if that is your focus as a gamer who wants to pick this game up and play it, you're going to get exactly what you wanted out of the experience. But when I broadened my scope a little bit, now having played many games throughout the years and having a bit more of a objective lens on looking back at a game that's 20 years old, even of that time, I can say that the little pieces, right, the level design, the sound, the fact that every level has a cutscene that's 5 minutes long that you can't skip, and so I kind of get bored of playing the game before it starts. There's no checkpoints. You have to go out and pick up dinner. Well, it's too bad. You're gonna have to replay the last 15 minutes of the game. A lot of that feels pretty old, and it's a little stiff and jointed by nowadays standards. And I can't knock it for just being an old game, but I can knock it for saying these were your contemporaries, some of them of which I mentioned, and here's how they've aged, here's how they held up, here's was their design philosophy. And when we look at Black compared to those, I can understand why someone might say, well, objectively, some of these pieces could have been a little more fleshed out. And so from a nostalgia lens, I love Black. For piecemeal breaking it up. I find the game to be incredible. I just wish there was a little more in there. And I think if they had the opportunity to make Black 2 a sequel, a direct sequel, then they probably would have likely accomplished many of those feedback points. So I'll say overall, it's a fun game, and I did quite enjoy it. So curious what you thought about Black. I think this game is usually very highly praised by most users in the communities, and I praise it as well. And I'm just trying to see a nuance of, well, here are the things that I would have liked to see improved. And so curious if you've identified some of those things, if you saw different things that maybe you wanted to see out of the game or would have hoped for a sequel, or if you're saying, hey Forrest, you're wrong, it's actually a perfect game. I'd love to know and hear your feedback. So please share your thoughts, and if you liked the video, please like the video and subscribe. Would love to have you around on the channel and join me for discussion about games in the future. Well, until next time, guys, stay well, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you again. All right, take care.